We are here in Connolly Bookshop today recording an interview with Richard Behal. Could you tell me about after you escaped from Limerick prison, when you were on the run, and what did the IRA take to all of this?
Well, yes, it follows on, I suppose, where we finished recording before, more or less. After the escape was carried out, initially I was out of Limerick City within minutes, despite the fact that they searched Limerick City and all Republican houses for days, and they put roadblocks everywhere for several days. I actually had been with my helpers on the outside during the escape. I was actually whisked out of Limerick County completely into a very unknown safe house in Tipperary. I remained there for some time, I think about 10 days, 2 weeks, after which I moved to across country because we're coming up on Easter Sunday, and went back to my own area of South Kilkenny, Waterford, where I had been living, and from where our unit had operated for the attack on the Brave Border in Waterford Harbour. And I was quite upset in that there were still IRA prisoners in jail, and this, you must remember, was the Golden Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. So it was a very, very important period in time. Like, for instance, next year will be the centenary of 1916. And my two comrades in Limerick prison, Walter Dunphy and Edward Kelly, who was since deceased, God rest them, they were not released, which one would have thought that, at least in the south of Ireland, that for all reasons political prisoners would not be held over the Jubilee year. And considering there was only 3 prisoners, that would be Walter Dunphy, as I said, and Edward Kelly in Limerick. And for some kind of a coincidence, the then Chief of Staff, I believe, Cathal Goulding, was actually in Mountjoy. He had been down the country, I don't know, was he camping or doing something, but seems he brought home some firewood or something, forestry, and I think he was charged with theft of government property or something. It was just a nuisance excuse just to get at Goulding. So he was in Mountjoy. I don't believe there were any other political prisoners at the time, but as we came up to Easter itself, they hadn't been released. And I thought that this was an awful insult to the memory of the men of 16 and the women, that on the Jubilee anniversary you'd still be holding prisoners by the Free State. So I determined to take action, and with some comrades of mine, we travelled from Dublin undercover back down to Waterford, Kilkenny area, and on the Easter Friday night there was a special Céilí taking place in Thomastown, being a nearby town to Kilkenny, and word was got to some of the Republicans that I was actually present. The most unusual occurrence happened in that, if you like, making use of what had happened for publicity reasons, it was actually a dance being run for the Republican cause. So I was brought in around to the back of the stage, and when the dancing stopped for the next dance, one of the lads went forward on the stage and said, "Oh, the doors have been locked because we now have a special guest." And of course I was introduced onto the stage. Well, of course, at the time, as I was in all the papers and the most wanted man in Ireland, I believe, at the time, there was great excitement and clapping and stamping the feet and cheering. So I gave a speech in which I said that while all the political parties in the south seemed to be coming together to have joint Easter commemorations, and but the whole thing was a bit hollow for the reason that no one was mentioning partition still exists. No one was mentioning that Pearse's dictum that Ireland unfree shall never be at peace, that there were still unsolved business in the freedom struggle. And it was just a matter of, it's something way in the past that had no relevance to today. So I felt that was wrong for a start, that the general public needed to be awakened to what actually the situation was. And then of course I gave a general Republican speech and said there are two comrades from this area, Ned Kelly from Mulnavat, Walter Dunphy from Mooncoin, were still in Limerick prison as political prisoners. So while I enjoyed the dancing and the merriment and commemorations over the weekend, to bear in mind that the struggle is not over. And I also mentioned, of course, we had another prisoner in Dublin on very frivolous charges entirely in Cathal. The doors were held while I disappeared. The funny thing is that there was I think he was a soldier home on leave at the time, and of course when he realised what was happening, he made a run to get out the door to get to the barracks, the guard barracks. And if he did, of course, he was, let me just say, he was detained. So no one could come in or out of that. I had about quarter of an hour. Of course, we were well gone by then. So I hid out lots of friendly houses and everything in South Kilkenny. And we did some sabotage operations, not involving civilians, just material damage, to draw attention to the fact that 1916, while being commemorated, that the proclamation hadn't properly been applied, and the dictates of the first Dáil government were still suppressed. Just to be aware of the situation in the country. It was a protest action, if you like. Now that did not go down too well, to put it very mildly, with the leadership then of the Republican movement, both Sinn Féin and the IRA, for the simple reason that a new departure had been attempted after the 1956-62 campaign, Operation Harvest. And when arms were dumped again into safe dumps in 1962, at the end of that operation in the north, that campaign, there was a questioning within the movement as to, well, we got 4 TDs elected, they didn't take their seats, as was the policy. We carried on a military campaign for so long, but at the same time the whole rising of people north and south hadn't happened, so lessons were being learned from it. And the ascendancy was coming up then of a new policy that maybe the gun was irrelevant, or certainly wouldn't be relevant until social matters would dictate it had to be. So it was a period of study of, at the time they called it the reconquest of Ireland by social agitationary means. And while it was a good policy as it went, it could only set the situation up which would build towards a reaction. Whereas the IRA, the army itself, purposefully began to be played down and to a degree dismantled, in that armaments were actually being sent to Scotland and I think Wales. Position was that some armaments were actually being given to people, the Free Wales Army and the Scottish, who were supposed to be building a Free Scottish Republican Army. But basically a lot of ammunition that was on hand was just being fired ad lib, whereas I know in our training days it was very hard to get shooting practice because you're always so tightly limited to the amount of ammunition. But I know there were camps being run around in the 60s where in fact ammunition was just being fired to get rid of it. So it was a kind of a pendulum effect which always seems to dominate in Irish politics. You're either over there or you're over there. It's either all armed struggle and not enough politics and social agitation, or it's all politics and social agitation and no army to back up any reaction that was going to come. And when you try to change the situation in any country, whether it's a foreign occupation or a national dictatorship, you'll always the same forces come into play. That once you begin to challenge the status quo or are causing them problems, there is always a reactionary move against you by police, repressive laws or military. So while you had fishings, this is fishing on waters and the rivers where landlords who got them with conquest and rewards for British conquest been back through the centuries. Fishing on their waters, they belong to the Irish people, the proclamation says so. We're challenging that. They were challenging all kinds of social mores, absentee landlords and rents still on their houses, and being paid to these landlords. All that type of agitationary work was going on. And it was, as far as it went, quite good. But I and several others were worried all the time that while we wouldn't necessarily feel that you should have a military or an army for the sake of having an army, but that politics being politics and human beings being human beings the world throughout, when you challenge the status quo, particularly a status quo that has privileges, they're not going to say, oh, okay, yeah, it's all over, take over. It doesn't happen that way. So if you're not prepared in the end to defend yourself and to strike for freedom if military forces are brought against you, you're agitating a situation that you're not going to win in, except you're going to be further repressed. So there was some bit of certainly, I don't want to call it friction, but there were certainly two distinctive camps kind of forming between the end of Operation Harvest in '62 and of course in '69 then with the civil rights in the north and the reaction of the northern states. It's a very interesting period.
And sorry, if you're talking about being armed, were Northerners more worried about the winding down of the army because they lived in the north?
Well,
and they were always fearful of repression.
Yeah, because I know, to highlight that, I know that I increasingly, particularly after the sabotage campaign around the Easter period, when we pulled off certain military operations against specific targets, but not personnel, to highlight the fact that the 1916 commemoration really was a bit of a travesty in the way that the state was treating it and the way the country was. They weren't facing facts. That it was of course a milestone and it was very important to commemorate the 50th, but that wasn't the end of it. Like, so what? Like, we've come this far, but why? What about the rest of what was promised in '16 and achieved in 1919, the restoration of all that? And so that was viewed very, very, very critically by both the Sinn Fein leadership at the time and the army. Yeah, a council who said, well, these actions taken by Behal and his gang, as they called it, but in fact they were Republican comrades who had proved themselves down the years, who felt similarly to as I felt, that they said that's only giving the putting militarism back in the picture over social agitation, and they saw it as kind of a clash. And others made a remarkable comment at a meeting of volunteers were called in South Kilkenny, Waterford, because they were asking, why is Richard Behal, our comrade, under such denunciation at the minute? Because he pulled off a spectacular escape, he had a good military and political record, and yet now it's anti, you know, we're hearing all this bad stuff about him. And so one of the new politicos, and many of them had come in actually from Britain at the time, and if I start naming names I'll probably forget to name one and name someone that might be offended, but they were people who had been active in England in Conley clubs and in different types of organisations sympathetic to the Irish cause, or actually Irish people who were involved in them. But they came back into Dublin in the early 60s, and their influence more or less took the movement over, and they had never themselves, from what I can understand, ever been true actually revolutionary militant politics and actions. It was theory. And the trouble with theory is it's all very right, but theory often doesn't quite sit with what is the actual situation. So while I personally had seen there was great room to advance what they were saying, there was also great need to make sure that our tradition of resistance and prepare to struggle wouldn't be wiped out in favour of purely political action, which was not going to work, in my view, and the view of several more people. So we were trying to keep, if you like, both horses on the course without them being antagonistic towards each other. But some of the new, I would say it was practically a political takeover of Sinn Fein and big influence into the Army Council at the time of this very, very, I don't want to call it Marxist, I don't want any definition on it, but it certainly had tones of all kinds of ideologies to it. They explained to this meeting of all the comrades and volunteers in Kilkenny Waterford at the meeting, oh well, you see, Richard Behal and people like him are out of their time. Those days are over. After all, gunmen, which I thought was meant to be a semi-insulting term, you know, are, what did they say, a shilling a dozen. It was reported to me. Well, it's this political agitation, takeover of houses like in Dublin, the sit-ins, the river fish-ins, and there was many, many, many other agitationary things, of which, as I said, as part of the struggle, I agreed with. But with them it was either this or either that, whereas with us it had never been either. It would be, you needed both elements. And I mean, I go with Pearce's dictum to a degree, which says, maybe I don't quote him word for word, but the gist of it is that only an armed Ireland can actually secure its freedom, and only by remaining armed can it in fact protect its freedoms, and that Ireland, with all its agitation, would be more or less laughable if it wasn't prepared to face the fact of being ready to defend its republicanism, its sovereignty, its freedom in whatever situation may arise. That I always felt the army should have been kept up to date, new weaponry if necessary, more intensive training, but certainly more political, not indoctrination, but political education on our history, on our struggle, but not only that, on the social economic matters. Because the first person I remember that I heard speaking on economic matters before the new scenario of the mid-60s, so with all these new people into it, many of whom went on afterwards, carried on as the official IRA with the split in '69, practically every one of them. with the exception of Rory O'Brady and Daithí O'Connell, who were two very, very far-seeing and very well-anchored revolutionaries in both politics and militant struggle when required, and who had a broader view of everything and could see the interplay in the mix, but they were kind of almost on their own. And but Rory himself was aware at a very early age that we needed to explain more about to the people. We're not just there to shove the British out, and if the loyalists don't like it, if they want to go with them, let them go, kind of, you know, simplistic stuff. That it was far more complex than that. In other words, what are you giving the people? And I would go back to 1919 Declaration of Independence, where it says the democratic programme, what are the citizens of this republic entitled to? So Rory did some early days work on forestry, mining and fishing. Now, of course, going to people who knew about these things, and he made a few little booklets. But I was always aware that we were terribly short of that type of stuff. There was no use just saying, we're going to drive the Brits into the sea, because that was never going to happen. But we could make it uncomfortable enough, and then with the world looking on and showing the type of apartheid state that the 6 counties were, where only certain people had votes, where houses were not given on a fair basis. I mean, the whole loss of civil rights. It was apartheid, except it wasn't based on colour, like in South Africa. That we had a very, very, very strong case. And so we needed both elements. We needed both the political agitation, but at the same time, that you weren't going to be treated as a joke, because you had to back up when the reaction would come. That's right. That I was under a lot of pressure from the then leadership, but people like Daithí O'Connell, Rory O'Brady, Paddy Mulcahy in Limerick, and many other famous guys at the time, while they'd be a little bit irked maybe by some of the actions that were alleged against me, or some of them which actually I did do, at the same time they remained supportive and loyal. And I actually became the meat in the grinder at the time, and I was to be used as an example to bring everybody else into line, that I was indisciplined and had taken unofficial actions. Of course, which I disputed, but for a long time people had believed that our action in attacking the warship in Waterford with the anti-tank had been a rash, unofficial job by myself and a few friends, which was of course totally untrue. And Cathal Goulding, Chief of Staff, acknowledged Chief of Staff at the time, had to actually issue a statement in which he more or less was quite critical of me, but did say that he had to admit that the action taken against the British warships in Waterford, in other words, action south of the border, which actually breached one of the articles of the IRA handbook, where armed action could never be taken in the south, that it had been allowed by him, and that he had directly given me the authority, which he had. And in fact, he had also arranged to acquire the anti-tank gun. That's a different story. We're really doing the aftermath now after the escape. So, with the exception of that, where it had to be admitted that we weren't the maverick crowd of people, there were still other things after the escape, the protest actions to draw attention to the hypocrisy that was going on at the commemoration of the Jubilee year, which was just a couple of months after I escaped. That still remained against me, so I was given what we would call a court-martial, but I have to say, God help us, it was the most illegal court-martial that could have been given against anyone, and it often made me very wary after, years after, in the whole northern struggle of the past 30-40 years, that when I hear anything about court-martials and actions to be taken, I was always being very, very careful, as far as I could understand it, to see that these things were fairly, and I mean fairly, carried out and everything. Ours was a bit, there was one other guy with me, were charged with breaking one of the articles of the IRA, in that we had appropriated army, i.e. Irish Republican government, equipment. And that was because in some of the actions for propaganda purposes, we did explode some bomb-making material and fired some shots in the air to make it look like a big hullabaloo. It was all propaganda exercise. It was not threatening anyone's life. And this was a joke, because that can carry a very serious penalty. In fact, in theory, it can bring in the death penalty. And I would imagine only for the companion that was with me, charged alongside me, I don't wish to name him, who was particularly well got with some of the leadership, I think I might have actually wound up being shot. I do know that there was talks of it, which would really prove to any of the wavering volunteers of Republican South Ireland that you did not cross the line of strict instructions and strict discipline as such.
I'd heard, sorry, that certain people at that time, that there was people in the IRA who actually wanted you shot.
Oh yes. Yeah. It came to an Army Council decision as to whether I would or wouldn't. Now, technically, my companion was as well, but it was fairly clear they would have made some excuse not. Again, because of personal friendship reasons. And that he stood loyal with me too. But it was not a fair, just, we were given no chance to explain why. We were given no counsel. And when I attempted to put a case, I was more or less told, we're not listening to that. So, I mean, that always made me, and to the present day, very wary that anything alleged against anybody, I want to be fairly sure that it's based upon sound proof and reasons and fairness of hearing. And I don't regret that. But it was because of that period between the ending of the border campaign in 1962 and the reaction from the loyalists to the civil rights campaign in '69, in those 7 years, a whole book could be written about it. There already has been several books. I won't quote them, but there are there covering all that period. There's one, what's its name at all, but it has been documented, and it was a terrible time of pulling and throwing, of clash of political ideologies and everything else, and it almost destroyed the movement at the time, because when they backed the civil rights movement and everything, and then of course the loyalist reaction burned Tollet, and so everything they were doing was grand. There was nothing wrong. But if you're going to do that, if you were going to go over and kick the lion or the sleeping dog, you were going to get a reaction.
And in
the meantime, the army had been allowed to go to seed. Weapons were getting lost. It was as though the army was redundant, would not be needed again. So when the North did blow in 1979, people, the wits, and there's some great wit in every situation in Belfast, going around saying, oh yeah, and their houses being attacked in Clonard and everywhere, and the Short Strand, and hundreds of houses burning, thousands pouring over the border. There was no reaction from the Republican forces, and they were going around Belfast, IRA, yeah, IRA. I ran away. And that is why within a short while the movement, the army split, and of course Sinn Féin split too first, because the politicos, just call them that, were taking it to extremes in that there should be no reaction. These had gone on and they were going to disgrace the British state and the world, and then the world was going to call for fair play in the north and everything was going to be rosy in the garden. Things don't work that way in the real world. In the meantime, the houses are burning, the people are pouring over the border, and it was clear that the loyalist state was going to protect its privileges, even if it meant having to kill. And there were killings of nationalists. It took a long time for to get back and be able to defend the people. And that was the first big split in '69, and entering Leinster House, accepting the parliaments, like politics were being rushed so fast into this new political agitationary period without paying attention to the history of Ireland, the history from 1921 of what happens when you start playing that game and where it was all going to end up. And it ended up at the Sinn Féin split. O'Brady and O'Connell would be the notable leaders of the Provisional Sinn Féin. Cathal Goulding, McGilla and others would be the recognised main figures in the officials. And then of course the army then split. You had the Provisional IRA. At the time I suppose Sean McStiffon, O'Connell and several more would be the best known. And on the other side again then you had the regular known IRA guys that went as the official IRA. And for a while, unfortunately again, like in all splits in Ireland, there was inter-fighting between them, and then the officials eventually split some years later, and of course you had the IRSP with Seamus Costello and others, and they had an internal confrontation with the officials, and more lives were lost, and all good lives, all good people, but unfortunately all these ideologies had everyone all over the place instead of realising that was now a clear-cut showdown with British colonial power in a colonial situation, and it wasn't being addressed, and it took quite a while, and it lost the initiative, if you like, for the Republican movement to have come out at that stage. So that is what happened to me afterwards. I had to leave Ireland because it was clear I was just going to be a bone of contention within Ireland. I was told that they'd be more than happy if I left Ireland, but still with this death threat over my head for what? I'm not still sure, but I know it was a kangaroo type court, and but I was to shut my mouth, disappear and say nothing.
And where did you go? Did you go to America?
Well, of course, I naturally did not abide by those conditions at all, and I initially was smuggled out of Ireland in disguise, and of all places, believe it or not, the best place ever to hide is under the nose of your enemy. I actually hid out near a British camp in England. I was at that time, I wouldn't say doing a strong line, I actually was engaged, and I was very anxious to see the girl concerned. And in fact, great lady she was, did actually manage to meet me once or twice in my hideout in England. So, great salute to her. And from that, I had contacts that I made through I thought there's a kind of an underground in every country. Even if it's not in an armed sense, there's always sympathy for the underdog or for agitationary people or revolutionaries. And it was put to me that I should go to Brussels. They had friends and contacts there of different nationalities who were also on the run, or they were political refugees or something.
And sorry, would these be like Basque people and people like that?
Pardon?
Would it be like people from the Basque country? The people you would meet, people like that?
Oh yeah, well at the time, you see, you must remember that in Europe, there was still a lot of disturbance in Europe, because Franco was in his heyday in Spain. You had anarchists, and you had Basques, and you had Catalans. You had a lot of discontented peoples in Spain, and a lot that were either had survived the Civil War or were sons and daughters of those. And of course there were still executions going on in Europe, and you had Salazar in Portugal, which was a very strong dictatorship, and you had other unsavoury regimes around Europe. So there was a constant flow of immigrants and a constant flow, some economic, but most of it had some political content, and Brussels seemed to have been a place where a lot of them gathered. And so I found out a whole new world. I managed to get to Belgium with help, and I was coached on what I was to do, met my contacts, found that the Flemish people were particularly friendly to me, because they, as you know, always imagine that they are Flemish or Dutch, and the Francophiles, as they call them, are French. And you have this, even in Brussels, you have quarters at that time. I'm going back now to the mid-1960s, where certain quarters of even Brussels would be all Flemish, or it would be all French-speaking. But generally I found that both the Flemish and the French people that I met extremely sympathetic to the Irish case, even though it hadn't blown at that time like it did some years later. And I got terrific welcome from all sides and support. But I also met some very, very interesting revolutionaries that were on the run from different countries. And I think that's where I developed my international outlook, far more than I ever had it in Ireland. And they were syndicalists, like trade unionists. They were people who had gone through the anti-fascist war in Spain, who were still anti-fascist under the Salazar regime in Portugal. And I found wonderful, lovely people, and all very helpful to me. So they were all under not all, but a good deal of them were under the auspices of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It's a mouthful. So I was advised and duly reported to the office of the High Commissioner for the UN of Refugees, and I was interviewed and everything. And an amazing thing is that I was actually accepted as a genuine political refugee after explaining my escape from Limerick jail, etc. And I still have in my possession somewhere my green documents as a refugee irlandais politique. And of course the government had never published in Irish papers, and it was kept hushed. But it was an awful embarrassment that here's a man supposed to be a criminal, escapes from jail on the run, and he's recognised by the United Nations as the first Irish political refugee. And so with that protection, I then could go to the police to register at the domicile, and the domicile I had was French, was Auberge de la Paix, the Hostel of Peace. Very lovely place, lovely people run it. Very, I don't know if it was the type of a religious order, but they had no political bias one way or the other, but just kind, and they recognised us as political people struggling for ideals who then were refugees. And So that was the situation. I was registered, the police knew I was there, therefore the Dublin government knew I was there. They could do nothing about it, or they'd be trying to extradite a recognised political refugee. And they weren't going to touch that. It was